Well, hello and welcome to this session of ExecuNet Masterclass. I'm your host, as always, Tony Vlahos, and my guest this hour is an acclaimed advisor to CEOs, senior leaders, and their teams. He's also an author, and his name is Dough Sundheim. So let's face it, in many organizations, communication stinks. The net result of poor communication is confusion, frustration, and ultimately poor performance. Today, Doug will draw your attention to approaches and tools that great communicators use that can make all the difference to you or someone else in your company. Really important stuff and a part of our daily commitment here at ExecuNet to connect you with trusted voices, people like Doug, who can show you how to pivot to your best career and work and be the kind of communicator and leader you want to be. Well, I am delighted to introduce my guest today. Dough Sundheim is an executive advisor, consultant, and coach with over 25 years of experience in growing businesses and helping others do the same. He works with leaders and teams of Fortune 500 companies and entrepreneurial firms to help them maximize their effectiveness. He's a frequent speaker on many business topics like leadership and organizational culture and strategy. He's delivered talks at Columbia University, NYU, the Society for Human Resources, and the World Research Group Conference, to name but a few. He's also no stranger to the firing line of business. He started a 100-person catering company in his early 20s, followed by several years in the marketing consulting field, where his clients included Sony, M&M, Mars, Mattel, and Motorola, among others. These days, his clients include Amex, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, and the U.S. Federal Reserve System. With that brief intro, welcome back, Doug, to the ExecuNet stage. They are all yours.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me, and welcome to everyone on the call. I know you've got a lot of different things going on. Thanks for spending an hour here with us and with me talking about leadership and specifically communication. Communication has been a topic that has been woven through everything I've done as a coach for years. And it's rarely something I pull out as a separate topic, but as I've noticed with so many different, the speed of business changing nowadays, and so quickly with so many different variables from COVID to technology, changing how we're working and interacting together in the office or in a hybrid environment, the opportunity for communication to be both an advantage or a detractor from your leadership has grown significantly. So I thought it'd be great to pull out some tools that have kind of been baked into a variety of different things I've done for many years and just create its own session around communication titled What Great Communicators Do That Mediocre Communicators Don't. So let's just dive right in. I want to share the 4 topics that will frame the conversation. We'll get into some tools and then open it up for Q&A. What great communicators do, 4 things I want to go through. First, and the irony of great communicators is the first thing that they do is they recognize that communication is always about to be terrible. I'll talk a little bit about that. It's always about to fall apart. I think anyone who's been in an organization can probably identify with that to some degree. 2, they prioritize it. 3, they structure it, so they don't leave it up to ad hoc structures, but they plan for it. And the 4th thing I want to talk about is they don't shy away from communication when it's tough. So they confront conflict in productive ways to help advance whatever issues they're working on. So this one. Number 1, always terrible. Communication is always about to be terrible. Start with this assumption. So even if it isn't terrible, I always tell my clients, expect it to become terrible in the very near future. It will always keep you on your toes coming from that perspective. I'm going to kick off with one of my favorite quotes from George Bernard Shaw. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I wrote a book a few years back called Taking Smart Risks. I actually wrote about this topic in there, and I named it something a little bit different, which is the communication blind spot. And this is something I've noticed over the years with my clients, and really anyone who operates in a complex environment. And it's that once something becomes clear to us, we have the tendency to think it's clear to everyone else too. And this is where the blind spot comes in. And I think just to kind of give a high level illustrative example of that, we've all been there when we're working on something big, let's say it's a couple month project, or it's a large scale initiative you're working on, and you get into it, you have a few planning meetings, you have assumptions shift and change, as a little bit more data comes in, you start to execute, you get a little bit more learning, and at some point you're 6 weeks down the path and you don't even really remember where and how you came to all the conclusions and all the insights that you've come to. And now it's important for you to go out and talk about this in the organization. And when you start doing that, one of the things we can all fail to do is be really clear about, how did I get where we've gotten to? What are the things, what information did I make a decision on, or did we make a decision on earlier? It's become so clear to me that I don't even remember that it's not clear to everyone else. And we all have been there. We all get into that spot in organizations. And if we're not cognizant of that, if we don't develop a real discipline about sharing not only outcomes of things that we're working on, but the processes we went through, the people involved, we can end up in this blind spot. And that's where communication can get terrible, even when we think that we've been pretty communicative about things that are happening or going on. So beware of the blind spot, recognize we all have it, we're all always going to have it, and we'll talk a little bit about developing some structures to try to shine some light on that blind spot more often. So prioritizing communication. I don't think that the idea of prioritizing communications is that groundbreaking. I think we're all pretty aware of how important it is. And yet still we don't do it. This is what I call an unscientific study that I've conducted doing this kind of work with clients over the past 20 years. And if I were to just guesstimate it, I would say leaders probably spend about 5 to 10% of their time on communication on average. And that in reality, they probably should be spending closer to a quarter of their time or more. As leaders get more senior in an organization, the value add really does come from some of the key processes with regards to creating meaning in the organization, right? So really listening to the signals in the organization, the signals in the market, the signals globally at this point in the game, framing and storytelling, engaging stakeholders and creating context. So one of the reasons why communication is so important now is because as we get inundated with so much information, and we're trying to possibly manage a team or an organization that has a group of people who are busy doing maybe a little bit lower down, some more of the tactical stuff. Sometimes they don't have either the skill or the time or the ability to really be looking out across a complex world, a complex set of stakeholders, creating kind of meaning and context, and then framing a path forward. That's the leader's job. And communication is much more than sharing words. Obviously, it's creating meaning and context. And that last bullet is by doing so, if we do it well, we inspire trust and confidence. This is what has us lead people in complex processes in an organization. To do all these things, it takes real time, focus, and energy. And I have found that people tend to shortchange it. So there's this idea of, let me kind of do the work that needs to get done, and then we'll just kind of get a little communication out about it, as opposed to really taking the time all along the way, communicate. It's like that line from, I'm going to transform that line from Glenn Ross, for all of you who've seen that. Always be closing, maybe is how a salesperson thinks about it, but from a leadership perspective, the ABC is always be communicating. Frequently, little bits, weekly, are going to be much more valuable than trying to communicate a variety of complex things a lot less frequently, let's say monthly or quarterly. Constant drips, constantly banging that drum over and over again is critically important. And that first bullet, obviously, very important too. You've got to listen to be able to make sure you're really nailing those points that are critically important. So that's a little bit about prioritization. What I want to talk the most about today is actually structuring communication, because I think we know it's going to be terrible. We know we have to prepare for that. We know we have to prioritize it. But what do? Well, we have to structure it. I think that the more complex business gets, the more important it is that we don't try to approach communication in an ad hoc way. Structures can be timing. Every Friday morning this goes out. It could be the way that you structure actual check-in conversations. So let's talk about a couple of those things. And to get into it, I want to talk about what we are communicating in our organization when we communicate. So when you think about communication organizations, what I always ask my clients to do, what I ask you to do, is think about it through the lens of decisions. So think about anything that needs to be communicated in an organization. I would argue that the vast majority of it, probably over 95% of it, it always surrounds decision making. So here's a few areas. What decision is being made? I think probably wouldn't be surprising to many of you. You've been in organizations for a long time. Just actually being clear on what decision are we making? What are we teeing up? What are we driving forward? Sometimes there's a real lack of clarity on that. So being clear about that. What's the timing around this decision? When do we have to make it? What's currently known or not known about this decision? What information do we have that's filtering into our decision-making process? What is that process? Who's involved in making the decision? And once it's done, what thinking went into this decision? So it can be maybe a different perspective to think about communications in relation to decisions. But if you really step back and think about it, it's almost the communications that people want, the communications that you want, almost always have to do with a decision that's about to be made, that's already been made, that people think needs to be made. It's always about decisions. And one of the topics that I work with clients on, and this I think really cuts to the heart of why communication can get so complex, is that decision-making is a broad, what I often call 6-step process. And so this is a decision-making model. This session is not about decision-making, it's about communication, which is attached to decision-making. But I want you to look at this model and think about communication and what sort of communication is required at each step along the way. So if you think about in the beginning of any process in an organization, a process of exploration is what I would call a divergent process. We're expanding thinking and deepening understanding. What are the objectives when we diverge to engage, explore, and expand? Well, we want to frame the decision. What's the decision that we have to make? You're going to get clear on what, why, when, and how. What's a deeper understanding of some of the issues that are at play? It's a lot of communication that has to go on there so that we're really clear that we're operating from a same set of what I would say the starting point of A. And then we have to push each other's thinking. I'm thinking this, I'm thinking, you're thinking that. What about this? What about that? There's a lot of friction and pushing. It takes really strong communication in order to do that well. If I've got a set of assumptions about what's driving maybe the forces behind a certain initiative or project, but I'm not sharing them, and you've got some and you're not sharing them, now we've got this place where we're not going to be aligned. If we try to turn that corner and converge, if we're not aligned on some of the core elements of why we're doing what we're doing, what's the critical set of objectives, what are the considerations that I have on my mind, and we try to get to a place where we turn the corner and really clarify a path forward, and we start to cut stuff away, we can end up in a lot of trouble. But then we get to a place where we think we've teed stuff up well, we turn that corner, we start to distinguish, decide, and define. And you can imagine in the beginning, we're really communicating to understand where are we at? Where's each person at? Where's each group at? Where are the stakeholders at? Great, we've done that. I think we've got everything on the table. We got clear, we got aligned. Now we've got to start making decisions. We've got to start choosing best alternatives, best paths forward. And now we got to define the direction forward. And now we can communicate that. And when we go out to an organization, let's say that it's an executive team or a smaller group that's gone through this diamond of decision making. Once we go out to the organization, we don't want to just share the end state of what we decided. We want to share the whole process. How did we engage? How did we talk? Because people really want to know and they want to better understand, okay, great, you got to A as your answer. But how did you get to A? What information did you pull up? What information did you disregard? That kind of stuff's really important. It's an art to figure out how much to share, where to share, but beginning to think this way, expansive to then decisive processes, communicating all along the way is critical to good decision-making and eventually good execution and ability to inspire trust in people in the organization. 3 tools I want to talk about that I like to use. I work with a lot of my clients to use, and you may have versions of this or ways you've done some of these before, but these are really straightforward, really simple, really powerful, and very often seldom done. Just taking these 3 and putting them to action can, I would imagine, have a very positive material impact on possibly some of the projects you're thinking about working on. So I'll just take them one at a time here. The first is a decision brief. This is a brief before a decision is made. There's a big project that we're thinking about working on. I've got to get a group of maybe different executive teams aligned in my organization about it. What are the key things that we need to know, we need to talk about? One, clearly defining the decision to be made. Sometimes it's a question. Should we do A? Should we pursue this? Should we take this path versus that path? I know some of my clients recently, it was like, should we go full hybrid? How should we do the decision around flexible working arrangements? There's something that has to be made, clearly stating it so that it's well understood by everyone. The decision rights, number 2, and let me go into that and then I'll come back to this. Who's involved in making the decision? Let's define the roles. Some of you may have heard of a RACI model. I've used one called the main decision rights model. We're making a big decision about a path forward. Who's got the responsibility to make that decision? So that's the body of people that are actually working it, pulling up the data, generating the insights, and then coming up with a conclusion about, I think we should go down path A. Approve, that's a governance body. Sometimes it's a board, sometimes it's an executive committee. They will take the decisions that the body who made the decision gave them, and they will usually kind of say yes or no, but they're not the ones that are digging in and actually making the decision. Input, these are people who have rights to provide the makers of the decision with input, but they don't have the rights to make the decision. And the notify is a body that can get notified of the decision once it's been made, but they're not providing input or making the decision. So it's really clear to understand who has the make rights in a given decision, who has rights to provide input. You'll see this a lot, that a decision will get made and a group says, well, you didn't check in with me. And there was never really any clarity on who were the bodies that really needed to provide input. So I won't stay on this for too long. You likely have seen models like this before, but number 2, decision rights, being really clear about who's involved in making the decision, defining those roles, which then connects obviously to number 3, the process. How are we going to engage different bodies? And again, I'll see this a lot in an organization. A decision will be made. Someone will say, well, I wasn't part of the process. We'll say, well, we invited you to the process here. Well, I didn't see the invitation. And wait, but when were we gonna, and there's so many questions start coming up. Lay it out. What is the process? Which then goes into the 4th one, timeline. When will we make this decision by? What are the key milestones? When will we check in? Do we have some draft set of insights generated before we make the decision. And then finally, how we communicate it. So this is, I often say to clients, put this down in a 1 or 2 page document. You're making a big decision, force yourself to go through all of these and then get that out to the bodies that are related and relevant. This in and of itself starts the communication process, because someone says, oh, actually, we didn't include this other body. This group over here was really critically important. Oh, that's a great point. I didn't think about that. Let's change the brief. The brief gets a set of assumptions out on the table so that everyone can see them, and having them out there, it starts the communication process long before a decision gets made. So then we get to a part where the decision brief hopefully is out. There's a great process. People are engaged in the right decision roles. You follow a timeline, and then we've got to communicate the decision out. And that's where I recommend using a tool called the decision outcome, which is 4 parts. It's after the decision made. Number 1, clearly, here's the decision that we made. Number 2, here are the key points of consideration. In making this decision, we really looked at 3 main variables, 1, 2, and 3. We thought about this, we thought about that. We really found this point really compelling, so we're going in this direction. The process, how did we do it? Well, we did it. We really didn't do this quickly. We took 3 months. We engaged these few bodies. We got this great input, which was very helpful. And then finally, the next steps. Given this is where we are now, here's how we're going to roll it out, and here's how we're going to monitor the efficacy of whatever decision. I have found in organizations that mostly when people say, you're not being transparent, you're not communicating enough with us, we feel like we've been left in the dark, we're not in the loop on stuff. This one tool, the decision brief is great, engaging the bodies is great, really important to do that stuff. And this one tool, the decision outcome communication, has had, in my experience, the largest positive material impact of any, because it forces the people making decisions to be really clear about how they got there and to bring people in to some degree of clarity to how the process rolled out. And that's really what people have questions about when they say you're not being transparent. They want to know how different decisions were made. Okay. The final tool I want to talk about is the check-in. The check-in is probably the most basic tool that is so often missed in communications. And it's, again, ensures that key conversations get out on the table. There's a variety of these. The Army has a kind of a detailed one called an after action review. Some of you may have heard of. The Air Force uses one called the debrief. I recommend with my clients, with key people on their team, with their whole team, you do these at least weekly. And it can be very quick check-ins. It can be 15 minutes on a Friday stand-up. If you're someone who knows Agile, or you work in any sort of Agile frameworks, you can do quick stand-up meetings. This has a certain kind of very brief retrospective feel to it. Just looking back and looking forward. There's actually a 4th question here. It's kind of baked into the 3rd one, which is what are our next steps? But what went well? What didn't go well? And what should we start, stop, and continue? To read these, it's pretty obvious that these are important questions. And in the course of our day-to-day business, we can often just not do them. We cannot check in. And this is another example of where communication can go terrible. You can know that these are important. You can do these for a month. You can get really busy. You can stop doing them, and communication can break down. So it's really a forcing mechanism to ensure that you're stopping and you're checking in with yourself, your team, and you are just making sure that everything kind of gets out on the table. So pretty basic, but really critically important. The fourth topic I want to talk about is not shying away from tough conversations. So where communication can, I've often found, really go awry is the uncomfortable conversation that never gets brought up. There's a lot of resources out there. We're having tough conversations. Some of you may have read some of them. I happen to really like a book called Difficult Conversations from the Harvard Negotiation Project about 20 years ago. I use a map in their book, which I think is excellent, that you can grab a copy of their book and have a look at, which essentially forces you to look at why is the conversation tough for you? What might other people be thinking? And how do you plan for it? There's one tool that I recommend that I will share here for really getting clear on where a conversation, where there may be conflict in a conversation that you're not bringing up. It's called the left-hand column exercise. So if you step back for a second, you think about a conflicting situation, a place where you know that there is a difference between what you're thinking and what you're saying. You know that there's some sort of something in the water in between you and another person, between two people on a team, and you realize that by not getting that out and communicating about it, it's going to have a detrimental effect ongoingly. First thing I say is, so the right-hand column is just kind of what is the nature of the conversation visibly that we're having right now. So for example, if we get to a situation where I have a very strong opinion that we should move forward in a certain way, and it's not shared in the group, and perhaps I say a variety of things. I may say, I think we should do A. Someone else says, I disagree, and I keep quiet. And it's now 1 week later, 2 weeks later, and we're moving forward, and you can just feel we are not on the same page. Take down what actually was said on one side of the column. On the left side, and this comes out of work out of Harvard Business Review, head of Harvard Business School, excuse me, from Chris Ardress from back about 20, 30 years ago. What am I thinking or feeling as that stuff is being said or as that was being said? And so I might say, okay, great, fine, Bob, we'll move forward in that direction. And on the left hand, I'm thinking, I don't think Bob really understands the nature of the problem that's going on here. And I think we're going to be in a lot of trouble. But maybe I keep quiet about that. Maybe once, that's fine. If that happens again, and then again, we can get into some real trouble. So one of the reasons why this is a useful exercise is it's a forcing mechanism to see how is what's going on in what I'm feeling or thinking different from what I'm saying or doing. And there's nothing prescriptive to do here other than to notice that if what's written in the left column remains materially different from what's in the right column for too long, the chances are you're going to have a big issue. So what I always say is find ways, whether it is perhaps you're using an executive coach that can help you with this. Perhaps you've read some good books on it, Crucial Conversations, Fierce Conversations, like I said, Difficult Conversations. Figure out a way to close that gap. The longer you live with a gap between what is on the right side and what's on the left side, the harder it is to get strong communication in your team or organization and ultimately have great execution. So I want to just share a final thought. I'm about 5 or 8 minutes shorter than the 40, but hopefully we can open up for some good conversation right here. The final thought I want to share is why do we worry and think about communication so much? And it goes back to that point on the slide where I showed 10% to 25% and prioritizing, why it's so important. And it's because there's an opportunity in communication to really create a strong sense of community in an organization. And this is captured well, I think, by Rollo May, a famous psychologist from the 60s through the 90s. He had some great books called The Courage to Create, and was really a great existential psychologist. Communication leads to community, to understanding, intimacy, and mutual valuing. And I love that last part, mutual valuing. What is, I think, really a challenge in business nowadays is figuring out how do we get aligned when everything is moving so quickly. And when we figure out how to communicate, stay in contact constantly using some of these tools to keep each other kind of aligned and up to speed with each other, we not only perhaps create more momentum for our business to drive our business results, but we actually have an opportunity to strengthen community and relationship. And I think one of the big takeaways from the past couple of years is, if you look at any of the literature these days, the popular literature about stakeholder capitalism or ESG stuff, is that people are looking for something out of an organization beyond just driving shareholder value, beyond just profit, beyond just money. They're looking for real value and collective mutual values so that they can say, I want to be a part of that organization, and I feel like I can fulfill my purpose there. So communication, where it was a utilitarian tool, we often thought about it that way, really becomes this transformative tool in being able to connect people to deliver beyond just profit, but real value with each other. So I will just lead with, I'll leave you with one slide here. I'll leave this up for a little bit. Ways that you can get in touch with me. I'm doing a fair amount of writing on communication, other topics. I've got a Substack blog called Notes on Leading, 3 times weekly. It's kind of 30-second, really quick 30-second reads. You can find out some stuff on my website, and you can email me as well. So with that, I will stop and pass it back over to Tony and see if we have any questions.
All right, Doug, thank you. Evocative as always. And everyone, check out Notes on Leading. I get it weekly, and I've got to say it's at times poetic, but always thoughtful. So really great stuff. Check that out, as well as the other links. So let's turn to some questions. Doug, on your decision brief slide, when you were addressing that, one observation, it can be unclear or unclearly communicated who owns the decision and the outcome of making it. So where does ownership and ownership of the result come into play here?
So that's really number 2. If you can still see the slides up, decision rights, who's involved in making the decision, definition of roles. So here on this slide, you can see the make decision. You want to be crystal clear about it. Whose job is it to make this decision? Is it, it's this body, it's this governing body, these 7 people, or this management group is over here. Just spelling that out in crystal clarity, because I think this commenter's point is right. We're not clear a lot of times, so let's not leave it that way. That's what I would call one of the decision rights, which is the make right.
Okay. So when we think about the individual components of communication, and in no particular order, we can all name things like there's data involved often, there's opinion or point of view, there's emotion as well, right? Talk to us about the power of emotion when you are desiring to be a great communicator.
Yeah, so I think that's where this idea of context and meaning making comes in. The reason why, if we go back to this slide, it really does require much more than a quick 10% of your time, is because on the right side where it says listening, framing and storytelling, engaging, creating context, inspiring trust and confidence, those are all emotion-based processes. They, in some degree, I have a tactical component to them. I've got to get the right information. But those are getting into the hearts and minds of the listeners and the audience to really understand what is it that they want to know, not just what are the 5 things I could share with them. And if I do that really well, if I spend the time to really listen, there's a great educational professor that I love called Parker Palmer, which he makes this point in his book, A Hidden Wholeness, called, deep listening is probably the deepest form of love that people can have for each other. And if we look at it as love or as respect, once we take the time to do that, I think we end up connecting emotionally with people. And the right stories and the right information and the right engagement strategies start to become really apparent. But if we don't do that, we start to treat communication kind of as this tactical set of things to do, as opposed to a set of relations to build. And then we get into trouble. And then we're down at that 5 to 10%. It's one more thing on my checklist, and then we get into trouble.
Got it. Yeah, your comments about Parker Palmer are right on. It reminds me of something I believe Alan Alda said, not while he was on MASH, that went something like, listening really means you're open to change. And I think that goes both ways, right? Whether you're the communicator or the person being communicated with, being a receptive listener tells that other person, I want you to change me. So here's your moment, right?
Yeah, agree.
Okay. So many of us look at communication, Doug, as a single event, not a series of touches, not a path. Give us some guidance, if you will, on how to turn it into something that lasts more than just the moment that we think it is, because it is something that happens over time if it's done really well, right?
Yeah, it's a dialogue. I would say we've probably gotten to a somewhat unproductive mindset around communication in organizations. You know, there's a corporate comms person, and they pump out communications, and it has a certain propaganda feel to it. There, of course, will always be a part of that in communicating in any organization. There's a message. We want to kind of convince people and get them to understand the main points, but there is a certain getting over on people background and baggage that communication has. So we'll never get rid of that. You know, that's the nature of our modern world. There's a lot of convincing and persuading that has to go on. Mm-hmm. But I think if we take that and we just put that a little bit on the side and we say, but there's also an opportunity for real dialogue, which is a deepening of understanding over time on both parties or on all parties. Then I think what we end up with is this realization that, well, if I'm going to have dialogue, it's got to be ongoing. I've got to do that regularly. And so you've got, genuine, CEO chats where they show up and they really want to engage in dialogue about stuff. Maybe it's not a whole town hall, but maybe it's a smaller group. You sometimes show up with questions, not with statements. Mm-hmm. Here's some of the things we're thinking about. What about this? What about that? There's a real, I think, where we can get into an unproductive mindset around communication is that when we think I'd like to close down, let me get the answers, and so that people know, as opposed to open up. Let me open up a conversation. Let me hear. Let's start that dialogue. There's a little bit of both. And I think sometimes we veer a bit too much to the former. Let's just get the information out, where we need to kind of add more of that latter, a real opening of dialogue.
Well said. I'm getting a chat that if you would please go to the last slide again, because people do want to have your contact information in front of them. Great. So this is more of a share, and I love that people are doing this. I'll read it verbatim. Another helpful tool is Knowing, Feeling, Doing, a tool created by Sam H. Ham, professor of environmental communication and internal conservation. Conservation or communication? Conversation at the University of Idaho. And Ham's research teaches that effective communication is not about organizing facts for maximum recall. It's about meaning making. Great term. So let's take some more questions. The communication process, Doug, this is from one of our listeners today, changed the last couple of years due to many team members working from home. I, meaning our chatter, feels that in the past we communicated more, we shared more information while we were together in the same facility than we do today working from home and needing to schedule a meeting for anything. How do you, Doug, see this process moving forward, and I'll ask, evolving in the future?
I think we're going to see people, for that very reason, wanting to go back into physical spaces more. Now, I think it'll be hybrid. I think people see the value of also working in a remote way. But I think for that very reason, you can't, as someone said to me, I used to get a salad every week with this one person, and we had a lot of great creative brainstorm, and I don't do that anymore. I think that people will miss that and will want to go back in the office. And that's where I think the smart companies are really coming up with hybrid ways. You're hearing a lot of this 3 and 2. We want you to be in 3 and out for 2. You pick them, you come up with your strategy, work with your team to do that, or the opposite, 2, 3, in 2, and you can be out for 3. But people are realizing, I've got to see some people. Something happens when we pass each other in the hall or we grab a cup of coffee that just can't happen in a scheduled world. So I think we're going to find our way back to something that does have more of a hybrid feel to it.
Absolutely. I will share that at ExecuNet, we have a hybrid model, but more important, we've said when we are having strategic conversations, we need to be in the room together because it's high touch. There are whiteboards. There's that sort of visceral reaction you have when you're physically with someone that's lacking when you're in Zoom. And yet when it's quick confirmation, like SWOT meetings, what have we implemented? What are the results? What's the impact? We can still communicate effectively through Zoom. So if that's useful to anyone, I share the secret here at ExecuNet. So on with the questions. Doug, how best would you communicate to a decision-making body whose individual members have differing and possibly conflicting views?
So I assume that the question means there's a body who's in charge of a decision, and this person would have some sort of input rights. So if you go back to that main decision making, one of the rights is you've got rights to provide input even if you're not making the decision. And what I would hope is that the decision making body is really putting a thoughtful process into place to solicit and elicit thoughtful input from the variety of stakeholder groups that would have the right to input into the decision. Now, if I read between the lines on that, on this this question, it may be saying, well, maybe we have those, but they're not doing a great job of it soliciting or eliciting from us, and they're not reaching out, or we've got a poor process. And if that's the case, the best you can do is really take the time, if you're so inclined, to just capture and just sometimes reaching out. Sometimes it's really, hey, reaching out to the person, Joe, I've really thought through this topic that I know is a big thing. I've got a couple of questions and a couple of things I'd love to share. Do you have 20 minutes? Rarely are you going to see a leader say, no, I don't have 20 minutes, because most people don't do that kind of reach out. It's also something that's really valuable from the perspective of showing that you're really engaged in a broad set of considerations around the firm or organization. So I would always recommend reaching out, but best case scenario is that you are included in that decision data gathering process. And if you're not, that ends up being a cultural problem eventually.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us, Doug, about giving feedback. You earlier alluded to, and I believe spoke a bit to the topic of uncomfortable communication, things that we don't really look forward to saying to other people, like you're fired or your work isn't very good. When we give and receive feedback, that is another, at times, really uncomfortable moment. Any tips you can share on how to become better at giving feedback and also taking it on, receiving it?
Yeah, there's obviously just tons written on this, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of time, but I'll share just a couple of high points. One is if you're going to give challenging feedback to someone, try not to beat around the bush at all. Just be really clear. I want to share some, this is what I always recommend. I want to share some feedback with you. There's two things that I want to share that I've noticed are really positive, and there's two things I want to share where I think there would be value in you looking at getting better, or you looking at ways to improve, however you want to phrase that. So let me actually start with the two where I think there'd be real value. Sometimes that works for some people. Sometimes let me start with some things I think you're doing really well. Sometimes that works. Some people really need that up front. Here's where I think you're doing really well, so they can feel that buoyed a little bit by it. Some people can't hear it at all. They're like, all I'm thinking about is the two things you're about to say that I'm not doing well. I'm not even going to listen to those things. So you kind of have to really feel your audience out on that. But once you get to the things to improve on, don't beat around the bush. Go right to them and just say, I think there's an opportunity for you to be a little bit clearer in your communication. I think there's an opportunity for you to think about how you're managing your staff, because we've gotten some feedback that you can be a little bit brusque in the way that you manage your staff. Just be right to the point and then go into it. Very supportive, very much with an eye towards helping, but don't beat around the bush. As far as receiving it goes, it's funny, when I give 360 feedback to my coaching clients, I always tell them it doesn't matter how much you can predict what you're going to hear. It always stings to hear it. So if you know that you can be really rough on people and it's had a detrimental impact on your relationships, and you just know in your heart of hearts that you do that, you've got your justifications for it, but you've kept doing it, and someone says to you, hey, you can be kind of tough on people, it still hurts to hear it. So going in, just know that feedback is really hard. Take a deep breath, recognize it as a gift, as something that'll help you get better, and that everyone has something that they're working on. And if you had it all nailed, you would be inhuman. So just recognize you're in good company with the rest of humanity. Take a deep breath and just let it come in, realizing it's going to sting a little bit. That's just kind of the nature of it.
Absolutely. Doug, the organizations you work with, do you find that most or some or none have I'll say a preset communication framework, a set of practices that they deploy when it comes time to either giving feedback or making decisions? Or is it more of, well, the moment is upon us, we have to make a decision, so let's find some way to communicate with each other? What do you find is the norm there?
I find most organizations have little to no good decision-making processes and communication processes. That it is an ad hoc, off-the-cuff thing based on whatever that executive does or is good at. And I think it's a huge opportunity for value creation inside of organizations, getting better at that. And you can understand the risk of why people don't do it. Number one, it takes a lot of time and energy, and so people just don't do it, right? I'm focused on the business of the business. I'm focused on the topical content of the things that we're doing. And, I've been hired because I'm really smart maybe in this one topical area, and I'm doing that stuff, but I've never really developed the skill set to socialize potentially conflicting insights that may be at odds with some other parts of the organization. I've never been taught how to do that. I know how to do the analysis, but I don't necessarily know how to bring that out and talk about it and share it. So it's not a natural skill set. And it's not something that people prioritize as far as the training goes. There's not a ton of training in this, in this kind of complex decision-making space. I do some of it inside of teams, working with senior executive teams. How do you set up processes? But it's really missing. I'll just give you a quick aside, a story. I was talking to this Fortune 500 company, very large financial services company. I was looking through their deck on all of their leadership development offerings that they have. And it was all just individual based. You get better at this skill, you get better at that skill. There was little to no effective teaming, leadership training at all. How to actually engage and set up processes as part of a team. And I think it goes back to the fact that we really we come from a traditionally kind of rugged individualistic culture. That's the US culture. That's a lot of business culture. And we tend to think that, well, if I can build this person, this person, this person, this person, this person with great individual leadership skills, and I put them all in a room, they'll just all be great together. And it's not the truth, right? You got to learn that engagement process stuff somewhere. So I think it's a huge opportunity.
Absolutely. I think we'll take one more before we start to wrap up. So we've all worked with or for leaders who just don't want to make decisions, right? It's not that they are bad at it. Well, I guess in a way they are because they don't make them, but they kind of avoid it and they ask things like, well, I need more information. I can't really make a decision. If you're a stakeholder and what you do next largely depends on the decision made, how could you best force that issue with, say, your CEO?
The best thing you can do is just share the impact of not having the decision made. Hey, I get this is really a challenging issue, or, and just as an aside, what I often say is, if you're making a decision, and this is something I talk about in my book on taking smart risks, with the book I wrote on risk taking, if you're making a decision, you can get to like maybe 65% assuredness, 65, 70, you're making the right decision. And then you just, that final 30, 35%, you're just never going to know. You're going to have to jump in. And so if you're not up there yet, meaning you've not collected any data, you don't know anything that's going on, and you're just kind of way in the dark, I would say you're probably right not to be making the decision. But if you're looking for that assuredness that it's the right decision, you're not going to find that either. And you've got to jump in at some point. So the best thing you can do as an employee in an organization is just say, hey, not having that decision made is really impacting our ability to do this, this, and this. I'm wondering when or how or at what point. Is there any way I can help, so that you can kind of force that issue? I think that's kind of the best that you can do.
Right. Okay, well, we're almost at the top of the hour. Doug, thank you so much for making time and as always sharing your insight with the executive community. Thank you to all who tuned in. There were many of you and you asked some marvelous questions. I thank you for that. And my joy is really getting to ask them of our session leader, because I learned so much just by getting to do that. So Doug, any final thoughts before we officially wrap up today's masterclass?
Just expect your communication to be terrible. And I think if you start with that assumption, you will always be communicating, over communicate, and you'll be creating, an opportunity for dialogue that will be, valuable far into the future.
Great. And I want to share some feedback. Someone wrote in, well communicated, Doug. So there you go. Thank you all again. Thank you, Doug. I look forward to seeing you at the next session of ExecuNet Masterclass. Bye for now.